Psalms 19, 1 through 4. It's on the front of your bulletin if you don't want to look it up in your Bible. Join with me and read along, please. The heavens declare the glory of God. The sky proclaims the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge. There is no speech or language which their voice is not heard. Their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the end of the world. In the heaven he has pitched a tent for the sun, which is like a bridegroom coming forth from his pavilion, like a champion rejoicing to run his course. It rises at one end of the heaven and makes its circuit to the other end. Nothing is hidden from its heat. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making the wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right and giving joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The ordinance of the Lord are sure and altogether righteous. They are more precious than gold, than much pure gold. They are sweeter than the honey from the comb. By them is your servant warned. In keeping them, there is great reward. Who can discern his errors? Forgive my hidden faults. Keep your servant also from willful sins. May they not rule over me. Then will I be blameless and innocent in the great transgression. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer.
Well, good morning and happy Sabbath. It's good to be here at Paw. Pastor Mike Taylor was one of my students a little while back at the seminary. Wonderful student, always asking good questions in class and stuff. And just a wonderful, wonderful person. I'm sure you're enjoying his ministry here. And he saw me at the seminary a while back, and he said, "Could you come and speak at Paw?" And I said, "Well, sure. Let's figure out a date." And so we did. So he sent a tweet this morning. I don't know if you've seen it. Where he was wearing a bow tie, and I tweeted back. I thought that was great. They call them a selfie, isn't that what you call them? You take a picture of yourself, and with my bow tie on here today. So we're glad that you're here. Now I'd like the deacons to hand out the listener guides if they've got those. Yes. Which one? He says which one? I said yes. Now if you want the adult listener guide. He'll give you the adult listener guide. If you want the young listener guide, I have listener guides for all my young friends as well. So there's 2 sets of listener guides. So, brethren, I think you just, you figure it out. You figure it out. And some people like to do both. That's fine too. But we want to get the listener guide. Now, if you look up here at the screen, you will see how this sermon is titled 3 Revelations That Will Change Your Life. 3 revelations that will change your life. Now, the adult listener guide will be in blue, okay? So when it comes to fill out part of the adult listener guide, you'll see it's in blue. For the young listener guides, I like the way it changes for the young listener guides. It's in green, okay? Everything is in green for you. And sometimes it's both the adult listener guides and the young listener guides together, and then, oh, here it comes, it's in this beautiful purple, okay? That's when you both get to fill in. It's on both sheets, okay? So the name, well, I guess I should wait for a moment while they're handing these all out. I've been at Andrews Seminary for 6 years, teaching New Testament is my field of study. My area of expertise is the Gospel of Mark, but I also love teaching 1st and 2nd Peter. I've taught Revelation and Romans, and I have a class I'm teaching right now called Love, Marriage, and Divorce. And talking about what the New Testament says about those passages. Before coming to Andrews University, I was at Union College in Lincoln, Nebraska, where I taught for 13 years. So it's been a privilege to teach at these schools. Before that, we were missionaries in Brazil. Eu falo português, se alguém aqui fala português, and we can talk afterwards. We were also missionaries in Malawi in Africa many years ago. So they're still handing out the listener guides, I guess. I don't know. Well, I'm going to go ahead and start and get going because I don't want to keep you too long here. We want to try to move forward. Now, the title of this sermon was 3 Revelations That Will Change Your Life. And the very first slide is a quiz on the meaning of the word revelation. What does the word revelation mean? Well, here's one use of the word revelation in a sentence. A new revelation in the recent scandal about Senator X, whoever Senator X was. These seem to come up in the news every now and then. Now, what does that word revelation mean in that sentence? Discovery? Yeah, maybe something surprising and obviously harmful, harmful news that we didn't know before. Somebody let out the information. Okay, now here's another usage. He was studying the doctrine of revelation and inspiration. Well, that's one we might teach over in the seminary. This is a teaching of Christian faith dealing with what God shows. This is the what God shows. And inspiration is how he helps the prophet to explain what he has shown to the prophet in a trustworthy manner. Now, the last one is, I was reading the book of Revelation yesterday. It was such a blessing. All right? Now, here, of course, the word revelation means a book of the Bible, but it's filled with these kind of revelations that God gives to people. All right, now, we're going to study about revelations today, and our passage for study is in the book of Romans, chapter 1, verses 13 to 24. If you brought your Bible, please open your Bible with me. If you didn't bring your Bible, take your Bluetooth, I guess not your Bluetooth, it's your smartphone or your iPad or your iTouch or whatever it is you brought with you. And open to the book of Romans, chapter 1. Romans 1, we're going to start at verse 13, and we're going to read through verse 24. Romans chapter 1, starting in verse 13, going through verse 24. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. Romans 1, verse 13. I want you to know, brothers, that I have often intended to come to you, but thus far have been prevented, in order that I may reap some harvest among you as well as among the rest of the Gentiles. I am under obligation, both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. So I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. Verse 16, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is what? Revealed. From faith to faith, for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. Verse 18, for the wrath of God is what? Is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Verse 19, for what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them, revealed it, you see. Verse 20, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Verse 24, therefore God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. All right, there's our verses. Notice that the verb reveal or show appears several times in these verses. In fact, there are 3 revelations in 3 verses. 3 revelations in 3 verses. Let's notice what they are. Here are the 3 revelations. In Romans 1, verse 17, we are told that the righteousness of God is revealed. In Romans 1:18, we are told that the wrath of God is revealed. And in Romans 1:19, we are told that the power of God is revealed. The righteousness of God in verse 17 is revealed in the gospel. The wrath of God in verse 18 is revealed against all ungodliness. And the power of God in verse 19 is shown to people in nature. Thus we have 3 revelations in 3 verses. Now, if you guess that these are the 3 revelations that will change your life, you would be right. 3 revelations that will change your life in these 3 verses. Okay, so now we come to the first, no, I guess we're not to the first listener guide statement yet. All right, consider where these 3 revelations are seen. Okay, the righteousness of God is seen, is revealed in the gospel. Now let me ask you a question. When did the gospel come? The big event for the gospel, when did it come? You forgive me, I'm a teacher, I ask questions. All right, he says in the beginning, all right, in it, the righteousness of God, the gospel. Right, well, maybe I should just ask you the question, what is the gospel? The good news. The gospel is good news. Now, we have some books in the Bible called Gospels. So what's in those books? Story of the life of Christ, isn't it? The story of Jesus. And the climax of the story of Jesus is the cross, right? The story of Jesus climaxes in the cross. So when we talk about the righteousness of God, we're primarily being revealed in the gospel. When we talk about the gospel, we're talking about the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. How long ago did that happen? Come on now, you haven't gone to sleep yet, have you? When did that happen? About, how long ago? About 2,000 years ago, like I told them in the story. A long, long time ago, right? Okay, it happened about 2,000 years ago. Okay, the wrath of God is revealed, Paul tells us, in the experiences of sinful people in our world. Now, we might ask the question, when does that happen? We'll come back to that in a moment. But let's look at the third one of these. The power of God is revealed in nature. So, which of these 3 revelations came first? You didn't know there was going to be a quiz in church, now did you? The power of God, yeah. This one came first. When was it revealed? At creation, okay? All right. Now, the creation story is in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. What happens in Genesis 3? Sin. That's right. Sin enters the world. So, the wrath of God, now we have to talk a little bit more about that wrath of God because that's a scary topic. But the wrath of God is found in the experience of sinful people. You had to have sin in the world before you had God's wrath revealed against it. And so the power of God comes first. Then the wrath of God is revealed against sin when sin enters the world. And then finally comes the righteousness of God in the gospel. Now, of course, the gospel was promised back when Genesis 3, when they sinned. But it wasn't fulfilled until Jesus came and died on the cross. Now, here's the funny thing. Right? The first one is talked about last. This is the first one that came in time. And then this one, and the last one he talks about first. Now, you might be thinking of the first shall be last and the last shall be first. But the Apostle Paul, his big topic in the book of Romans is the gospel, how to be saved, okay? And so that's why he talks about that first. But you have to understand that he lays down the foundation for the gospel when he talks about the wrath of God and when he talks about the power of God in creation, okay? So these are those 3 revelations, and he describes them in reverse order. All right, so now here we come to the listener guide. Here's the first listener guide for my adult friends. The power of God, see how that underlined word, that's the one that you put in the listener guide, the blank. The power of God goes back to creation. The power of God goes back to creation. Get ready for my young friends. There's one coming for you. The power of God goes back to creation. Here's for my young listener guides. See, it's the green one. The first revelation, I can see God's power in nature. Write it down. Write those words into your listener guide. See, I can see God's power, P-O-W-E-R, in nature, N-A-T-U-R-E. All right? Now there's another one for the adults. All right? I can see God's power in nature. That was the first revelation. Here's the second one. The wrath of God comes after the fall. The wrath of God was first revealed when sin entered the world, which had come after the fall of mankind. Okay? The wrath of God comes after the fall. That's the second revelation. All right? Now here's for my young listeners. There's another one for you. All right? The second revelation. God hates wrong and stands for the right. God hates wrong and stands for the right. All right? Give you a moment to put that in. See, we got 3 revelations. Boy, we got a lot of slides here to put these in. Okay? So we got to keep moving. God hates wrong and he stands for the right. So here's the third revelation for my adult listener guides. Righteousness comes through Jesus Christ. The righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel, which does not come to fruition until Jesus Christ is born and lives and dies and is resurrected, which happens nearly 4,000 years after sin entered our world and 2,000 years ago for us. The righteousness of God comes through Jesus Christ. And now, last for my young listener guides, yet one more. Jesus is the one who saves me from trouble. Jesus is the one who saves me from trouble. If you didn't get it with the adult listener guide, I trust you get it with the young listener guide. All right, now, we've said the temporal relationship of these 3 revelations is such that the revelation of the power of God is from the time of creation. The revelation of the wrath of God is from the time sin enters the world. And the revelation of the righteousness of God in particular is when Christ comes and saves us. Thus we see an interesting phenomenon. Paul covers 4,000 years of history in 3 short verses and mentions 3 revelations in reverse order of their appearance in our world. Why would he do that? What does this suggest? Well, the main topic of his letter, as we said, is salvation. But he must build his case historically, showing where the problem began and that the gospel, what called forth the gospel. Thus, he begins with the solution and works his way backward to the causes. We want to see the causes, so we will begin by talking with revelation number 1. All right? So, how do we know that God is there? Romans 1, verse 20. You got your Bible open to Romans 1, I trust. We're looking at verse 20 one more time. It says, "For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." Paul, along with all biblical writers, teaches that God is invisible. He cannot be seen. So the question is, how do we know that he's there? Paul says that his eternal power and his deity or divine nature are clearly seen in the things that are made. That means nature right outside the window. In fact, nature right inside this room. You and I are part of nature. Okay? Paul says that you can see that God is there. You can see it by what has been made. Now, there's another viewpoint in our world today. Some people disagree with Paul's viewpoint. They don't think that nature reveals God at all. For them, they believe that nature originally was inanimate. That means it was not alive, it was dead. Okay? And that complexity, life has evolved from the inanimate. Life came from that which was non-life. Complexity has come out of that which is not complex. Now, on the face of it, this idea seems pretty absurd. We know, for instance, that if you take a solution that has bacteria in it, and you boil it, and you seal it in a glass jar, so there's no air or anything in there, that it is going to remain dead. There will be no life inside that glass jar. And so we wonder, why do people believe that, somehow life came from non-life, and all the things that we see around us came from like nothing, from a great explosion? Okay? Well, let's take a little trip with that. We see the story. The idea of evolution comes from the most famous name connected with it is the name of Charles Darwin. Here's a picture of Darwin when he was an old man. And his famous book, written in the 1850s, known as The Origin of Species. Now, Darwin took a voyage around the world, and he was with some explorers, and he was keeping catalog. He was cataloging the things that he found. In particular, he came to a group of islands known as the Galapagos Islands. These are off the western coast of South America. And as he traveled from island to island, and he was cataloging the different creatures that he came across. The Galapagos Islands are famous for their tortoises and their iguana lizards. But Darwin was also noticing that there were certain birds, finches, in fact. And here's a picture of these finches of the Galapagos Islands. And as he went from island to island, he noticed first maybe ones that had big beaks like this. And then he noticed it looked similar, but it was a smaller bird, and the beak was changed a bit. And then he went to another island, and it had shifted still, and here it had shifted still. It looked like it was making a slow shift from island to island, all right? So he came up with an idea called adaptation. Darwin came to the very thoughtful conclusion that creatures adapt to their environment. He thought that this was taking place with these birds from island to island in relationship to the environment in which they lived. It has become known as the principle of the survival of the fittest. And we see it in nature today. Such adaptation does occur. And so in that sense, Darwin was right. Adaptation occurs. They've done famous experiments with this. There were some moths in England that were light-colored moths, and they blended right into the wood of a tree. And then the British started burning coal, and the trees all got covered with soot, and the light-colored moths showed up and were eaten by the birds. But the ones that were a little darker didn't get eaten by the birds, and then the moths eventually shifted and became dark-colored moths, because the ones that were dark-colored were the ones that survived best. So this idea that adaptation is not wrong. It's a correct concept. However, adaptation is visible in nature, okay? But to go to the next step is a very big leap, that all species originated in this way, right? And also a bigger leap to suggest that life originated from non-life. These are two huge problems. These are big problems for evolutionists. You don't usually heard it talked about, but we'll talk a little bit about it. And there's discussion that's going on among scientists about these issues. Okay, so here for our listener guys, the theory of evolution is based on the idea of the survival of the fittest. That's the adult listener guide. The theory of evolution is based on the idea of the survival of the fittest. I think I should put it in fewer words than 4. It takes a lot to write 4 words into the listener guide. Theory of evolution is based on the idea of the survival of the fittest. For my young friends, now, I always like to put into the young listener guide something with a big word. A big word, so you have to go home and look it up in the dictionary. Okay? I like you to look in the dictionary. A dictionary is a wonderful book. The evolution is a demeaning theory. All right? Evolution is a demeaning theory. What they say, what does that mean? Demeaning. D-E-M-E-A-N-I-N-G. Does that mean it's mean? Well, no, not quite. Demeaning. You say, I don't know what that means. Go look it up. Spell it, put it on your listener guide. Demeaning. The theory of evolution is a demeaning theory. Then you'll find out, you can talk about it at lunch with your folks. All right? Now, enter a man by the name of, did you get that written down? Demeaning theory. Okay? T-H-E-O-R-Y. All right? Enter a man by the name of Michael Behe. Michael Behe is he's not a microbiologist, he's a biochemist. a biochemist. So he talks about things that happen inside the cell at the most basic level of chemistry. He wrote a book that has become famous or infamous, depending on who you are, called Darwin's Black Box. He's a biochemist who studies the processes of life and their basic chemical level. In his book, he challenges in particular the idea of life coming from non-life and the evolution of basic biological systems that are seen all around us in nature today. Without getting too technical, life coming from non-life is a huge challenge for the evolutionists. They just do not have a good explanation of how it occurred. They have suggestions, but they don't have a good explanation. There are many theories, such as the following one. Right? This is Robert Shapiro's primordial soup theory. Okay? He said that the early Earth had a chemically reducing atmosphere. Now, if you don't know what a reducing atmosphere is, it's the opposite of an oxidizing atmosphere. Our atmosphere today has oxygen in it. It's an oxidizing atmosphere. And oxidation, we see it most commonly when we burn a fire. That's oxidation. Okay? And you're actually combining certain chemicals together to make other chemicals. It's called oxidation. It's very common in our world. Okay? The early Earth, according to these people, would not have been able to do that. You couldn't burn a fire because there was no oxygen in the atmosphere, according to them. Now, of course, we see lots of oxygen in the atmosphere today. Somebody says, well, that's interesting. Why do they say there was lots of oxygen, no oxygen in the atmosphere? Because it's impossible for the DNA to be made in the presence of oxygen. Right? The original basic building blocks of life couldn't come together in an oxidizing atmosphere. It'd have to be in a place where there was no oxygen. So that's an interesting problem, okay? So the early Earth had a chemically reducing atmosphere, according to them. This atmosphere, exposed to energy of various forms, produced simple organic compounds. All right, well, so far you might be able to agree with them that simple compounds, they've done these kind of experiments. These compounds accumulated in a soup, which may have been concentrated at various locations like shorelines and ocean vents and stuff like that. Now, here's the nice leap. By further transformation, yes, how did that happen? By further transformation, more complex organic chemical compounds, and ultimately life developed in the soup. How about that? Here's some of the problem for that. There's no convincing evidence of a reducing atmosphere. There is some, they talk about this, they argue back and forth about this. One of Stephen Austin, PhD, said, to the question, did the early Earth have a reducing atmosphere? We can say that reducing evidence has not been documented in the rocks, and evolutionists can maintain that a reducing atmosphere existed before any rocks available for study formed, but such a belief is simply a matter of faith. The other problem is that amino acids to life is a great big leap. It's about like taking a box of linotype from what they used to make printing presses with and blowing it up with a bomb, and it comes together and it makes a Bible. The chances of that happening are incredibly, incredibly infinitesimal. Okay, so here's the creationists' joke about this. They say, what do you get when you cook primordial soup for 1 billion years? You know what you get? Very old primordial soup. Very old primordial soup. Now, here's Behe's basic idea. He called it irreducible complexity. That's the whole point of his book. The name of the book is Darwin's Black Box. Darwin's Black Box. And what Behe explains in his book is Darwin's Black Box is the cell, the individual cell. Because Darwin said, if anybody can show that that it was impossible by a series of small steps for us to attain what we have now, then my theory would not be true. That was Darwin's challenge. And they didn't know what was in the cell back in those days, so they couldn't argue as well as we can today. Behe presents in his books the great problems focused around this question of irreducible complexity. Now, you see here a simple mousetrap. Let me tell you a story about catching mice. My wife and I lived in Nebraska for a number of years. We moved from one house to another, and we were out in the little town of Syracuse, Nebraska. You probably don't know where that is, but it's in eastern Nebraska, to the east of Lincoln and to the southeast of it. And we were living in a little apartment waiting for our house to be built there. And my wife noticed that there was a mouse in the kitchen. You know, you come in the kitchen, this little mouse scampers off. Well, you might be cute, but you know, mice carry disease and they're dangerous, so she wanted to be the man of the house to catch this mouse. Now, what are you going to do to catch a mouse? Well, you get a mouse trap, right? So I went to the store and bought those simple mouse trap thing. And you got to be careful with a mouse trap because those things are a little powerful, you know, and if you're not careful, you will bang it on your thumb or something like that, you know. So you got to open it up carefully and you set that little trap and you set it down someplace. What do you put on there? Cheese. That's the usual stuff. It's cheese. So I put a piece of cheese right on the trigger. So I set it out there on the floor in the kitchen. Came out the next morning. Mousetrap had not sprung. Cheese was gone. I said, this is a smart mouse. So this time, I made the piece of cheese smaller. He's got to tap that thing to get it. Put it out there that night. Came out the next morning. Mousetrap wasn't sprung. Cheese was gone. I said, you know, this mouse is smart. So then I took and I got some of that, you know, that shredded cheese you can buy at the store, you know, and I sprinkled it all around the mousetrap and all over the mousetrap, you know. Came out the next morning, there was Mr. Mouse. I took him out, he was gone. Okay, well, all right, sorry, sad story for Mr. Mouse. But go back to this mousetrap, all right? Now, the mousetrap has 5 parts. 5 parts. It has a platform, a little piece of wood, okay? It has an anchored spring. There's the spring, and it's anchored into this little piece of wood. It's a very simple thing, this. It has a hammer. That's the thing right there. Oh, I think the hammer is this big deal here, okay? It has a hammer. It has a catch over there on the end, and it has a hold-down bar that's connected over here, right? 5 parts. If you take away any one of these parts, it will not work. What if you took away the platform? Well, it would just be a spring and a thing. You know, the mice might run around there, but it's not going to kill the mouse. What if you took away the hammer part? Well, you know, you could put as much cheese as you want on there. The mouse is, maybe you kill the mouse with so much cheese. I don't know. But if you take away the catch, you know, any part, every single part is necessary. That's what we call irreducible complexity. Okay, now we come to a biological system, something we call the coagulation cascade. Little girl she fell down and skinned her knee, and it bled for a while, and then it turned into a scab. You say, it's just a scab, Pastor Shepard. It's just a scab. Do you know how complex a scab is? Let me show you a little bit about how complex a scab is. Do you realize that there are 20 steps in what's called the coagulation cascade? 20 steps. All 20 are necessary. Okay? We're talking about irreducible complexity. In fact, there's a disease known as sickle cell anemia, found mostly in Western Africa. Sickle cell anemia, people of African descent are more prone to this, and it's missing one of these steps. And the cells of the blood turn sickle-shaped. They don't carry the oxygen properly. They're not made exactly right. You need every single one of these kinds of steps for the thing to work properly. You see, it's a pretty impressive idea that you can cut yourself, the blood can come out, and it can stop bleeding. You say, well, that happens all the time. Yes, it does. Can you imagine what would happen if it didn't happen? You would pretty quick be dead, right? Well, somebody says, well, maybe that's not so big deal, because what happens if you expose blood to air? It just all has that thing that makes a scab. Well, have you ever thought that it's very interesting that the scab doesn't go inside the blood vessel and go up the blood vessel and go all the way to your heart and coagulate all your blood? It doesn't. Why doesn't it do that? Coagulation cascade, thank you very much. How did this come about? How do you get all that together in the same place? And you have to have everything there at the same time for it to work. See, this is the problem for evolution because they want little tiny steps. And so Behe, in his book, he describes how he went looking for an explanation of the coagulation cascade. He said, surely the hematologists, the people who study blood, would know. He went and he reviewed 10,000 articles to find out if they had a method that they would suggest how the coagulation cascade evolved. He found 2 articles, count them, 2 articles out of 10,000, and those 2 articles did not agree. All right? And he went through this, and he kind of gives the evolutionists quite a hard time. He says, look, you guys don't have the biochemical basis to say what you're saying. You're just basing it on your faith in evolution, okay? Well, you and I have faith in the Bible. Those people have faith in evolution, but we admit it. We admit that we have faith in the Bible. They say, no, it's not our thing. All right, now, here's a cool little explanation of pus. Oh, somebody says, oh, pus. That is such a terrible word. It's not an exciting topic. It's yucky. It is, in reality, dead white blood cells. When you get an infection someplace, then the white blood cells, listen to me, white blood cells come out of the bloodstream. I mean, they're white, they're blood cells, so they're in the bloodstream. They come out of the bloodstream. You say, how do they get out of the bloodstream? They get skinny and they squeeze out. That's exactly what happens. You say, how does that happen? I'm going to show you a little video that shows you some of that. But they come out there and they eat up all the bacteria. You see? So they're very, very important. White blood cells protect us from infections. They are circulating all the time in our bloodstreams, but they have to get out of the blood vessels into tissues where the infection is taking place. Now, I've got this cool video called The Dance of the Cells. You got that down? Dance of the Cells. You can go to YouTube and watch it. If you want to see a longer video, this one's about 3 minutes. The longer one is like 8 minutes, and you'll see this is pretty cool little stuff. I want you to notice certain terminology that was used. They never made reference to evolution here, but they were quite excited about the whole thing. You notice that? Everybody was quite excited, okay? Now, here is let's see if I can get this slide to work. All right? Okay. The language of irreducible complexity is in that little video, if you listen carefully. They talked about the roads growing where they are needed. Isn't that interesting? How do they know where to grow? The road is built, he said, as required. Who's requiring it? Okay? The motor protein is walking along the microtubule. It doesn't have a brain, my friends. It's walking, though. You could see it. It was walking along. It looked like a little man pulling this big sack behind him. All right? He said the foot only fits in one direction, going one way. The grooves were preset. All of this is happening in your cells all the time. Your cells are not simple. They're extremely complex. As I said, these are problems for evolution. Elegant, he said, it's elegant and exquisite. You see? Now, here's evolution's problems. Evolution faces a major problem in the origin of life and the complexity of life. Faced with these 2 major problems, the origin of life and the complexity of life. On my young listener's guide, that was evolution faces a major problem, the origin of life and complexity of life. For my young friends, we say a mousetrap has to have all its parts to work. So does a cell in your body. A mousetrap has to have all its parts to work. Now, the basic idea here, my friends, is that this was designed, you see. And this irreducible complexity points towards a designer. There's an old argument about the existence of God that goes with this. It's called the watch and the watchmaker. If you found a watch out in the woods, would you think that it just happened to show up there? You say, no, somebody dropped this. And then if we said, but where did they get the watch? You say, well, they bought it at Walmart. Okay? Yeah, maybe they were, let's knock this a little bit. Maybe they were, isn't Walmart where all the real people shop, right? All of us who don't have millions. Boy, oh boy. Yeah, okay, we get that back in shape. But somebody had to make the watch. You have a watch. If you have something so complex, you assume that there is somebody making it. See, that's where this points to God. All right? So, our next listener guide, nature shows us God's power and His intelligence. We've taken a little while to build this, so we got to move on quickly into the rest of our slides. But we notice that Paul's statement is still true today. Paul's statement is still true today, that nature reveals God's power and reveals his intelligence. Now, if we quickly move on to the next revelation, Romans 1, verses 19 to 23, we want to read about how God relates to people and how they relate to nature. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. Now notice what happens. For although they knew God, they knew he was there. Although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. All right, notice what Paul teaches here. The consequence of this clear revelation is that people are without excuse. Paul states that nature shows us God. And when people don't acknowledge him as God, they're just closing their eyes. There is no excuse. Where does this lead? Paul says where it leads to is idolatry. All right? Now, please notice, here's for both listener guides, an important one, surprising truth. Idolatry is the primal sin. In other words, they are guilty of disregarding God, which is a major mistake. Their lives become focused on material things around them. In our day, we would say money, power, sex, drug, amusement, position, whatever. Anything that is on our level and not above us. This is the primal sin, idolatry. Anything that you place above God in your life is an idol. And Paul says that's the primary problem of the world. The world has gone into idolatry because it rejected the revelation God gave us in nature. I'm talking about revelations that impact every one of our lives. Okay? Now, let's notice what happens. Okay, here's a summary. The power of God is seen in nature. People reject this revelation. They do not want to recognize him. Thus, they turn to idolatry, and as a result, they are without excuse before God. He showed himself, and they rejected that. Where does that lead? That leads us to Romans 1, verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. The second revelation is the one that scares more people than any other. It is the wrath of God. All right. Now, I'm going to skip over this explanation of the wrath of God here in Romans 1, 24 to 32 for time's sake, but I suggest you go home and read that passage. And Paul talks about a whole variety of sins, and he talks about how God's wrath is expressed there. The terminology is God hands them over. God hands them over. He says he hands them over to the passions and evil desires that they so much want. Now, some people think that this just means that God lets them go and just says, you know, you can have the result of whatever you do, right? Actually, Paul is a little more active, has a more active concept than that. He says that God hands them over to that. We like to think that we're in charge of our lives, but there's an old Chinese saying about alcoholism. You know, alcoholism is an incredible problem. It kills 100,000 people in the United States every year. Somewhere between 80 and 100,000 people every year killed by alcohol. Okay? And we have an estimate that there's probably more than 10 million alcoholics in the United States today. It's extremely destructive. And some people think, oh, I can stop anytime I just take a drink. There's an old Chinese proverb that goes like this. A man takes a drink. A drink takes a drink. A drink takes a man. A drink takes a man. It's extremely destructive. And idolatry always leads to that path, to that end. Somebody says, why does God do that? Why does he hand them over to those things? Why doesn't he stop them? Because God gives you free choice. That's so important to him, that you freely choose. See? So he gives you the opportunity to make choices. Now, what you do with those choices, you know, you can get yourself handed over. Now, let's understand a few things about the wrath of God. I've got to clarify a few things here. First of all, the wrath of God is his holy hatred of sin. If you were walking into a super Target store this time, let's say. You were walking in and you saw somebody walking out of that store, great big 6-foot guy, he'd been lifting weights and he was huge. And he was dragging behind him a little tiny girl. And the little girl was crying. And he said, "I told you not to touch that candy." And you're like this. She said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Dad. And he takes and he slaps her across the face, and her face is all red and you see it. And he says, "There'll be more of this when we get home." Boy, what do? I can see the moms reaching in, pulling out their phones, calling 911 right away. But what if you didn't have your phone? I tell the manager of the store. But what if you were just too scared and you went in and you were just walking around Target? How would you feel? You would feel terrible. Not only would you feel terrible, you would feel guilty. You would say, "I should have stood up to him. All 5'6" of me. I should have said, "You stop that!" Right? We call that righteous indignation. Am I right? Righteous indignation, because he's mistreating that little girl, right? Righteous indignation. You want to stop him. And if you don't do it, you feel like, "I didn't do what I was supposed to do. I feel guilty." All right. That's a little bit of understanding. Take that, multiply it by 1,000,000, take away all the human dross, and what you get is the wrath of God. It is his holy hatred of sin. When he sees sin, it's like the world has been hit by that little girl that's been hit, and God just can't take that. He hates that kind of thing. He cares about people. It's wrong, right? It's his holy hatred of sin. The wrath of God is active. He doesn't just stand back. He actually hands people over. You say, "Why is he doing this?" Watch. The wrath of God is fair. It's not unfair. It's not something evil. The wrath of God is compatible with his love. You see, God is in the business of dealing with sin, and he's in the business of cutting out the cancer of sin, all right? And part of the process involved is his wrath. Now somebody says, "I don't get this. How can be a loving God be a God of wrath?" You have to understand the 3 revelations. The first revelation is the revelation of God's power. Everybody recognizes that, really. They see it in nature and everything. What they don't understand is this idea of wrath. God hates sin. He hates sin. It's like oil and water. They just don't mix. God and sin don't mix. He hates sin. And so his wrath is revealed, Paul says, by handing people over. All the trouble that you see in the world around us, all of this, people destroying their lives and everything, God handed them. Somebody says, "Doesn't he love them? Doesn't he love them?" Hang on. We have another revelation here. We're not done yet. Here's the 3 truths. The wrath of God is holy, it is active, and it is fair. The wrath of God, this is the adult listener guide. The wrath of God is holy, active, and fair. For my young listeners, God hates sin. Just basic. God hates sin. Where do we see the wrath of God revealed today? Paul says it is in the vast array of out-of-control sinful behavior that fills our world. God hands over these people to the sinful desires that they embrace. Now, boy, I can see I don't have time for all the things that I've included in this sermon. I'm going to pass over Revelation 14, 9-12 today. We just don't have enough time. We'll just say here, the responsible thing to do, his reaction to sin, his love is eternal. Yeah, I'm going to move on to Romans 1, 16 and 17, because this is the revelation that solves the problem of the wrath of God. All right, it says here, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith." The first revelation we noticed was God's power in nature. When people turned away from God to worship creation, this led to the expression of God's holy anger against sin. Since we are sinners, that means that we are all out of step with God. So is there any hope for us? Paul answers, yes, there is. All right? The third revelation must follow the first 2, creation and wrath. Without the recognition of sin, people feel no need of the gospel. I want to say that again. without the recognition of sin, people feel no need of the gospel. See, we have to talk about creation. We have to talk about God's holy hatred of sin before people will recognize that they need the gospel. All right? We've sort of short-circuited this a little bit because we don't like to talk about this topic of wrath. Creation without recognition of God leads to the expression of His wrath, but that brings people to the gospel. What people do not recognize, they do not feel a need for. This is why you must recognize you are out of step with God in order to understand the meaning of the gospel. And this is what happens to everyone who comes to the gospel. They recognize that they're out of step to God and they need His help. Okay? So, the righteousness of God is a positive word. It is found in the gospel. The gospel is the power of God unto salvation, says Paul, and it is received only by faith. All right? Let's put that in the listener guide. Right? The righteousness of God is positive, is found in the gospel. It brings us salvation. It is received by faith. It is received by faith. The righteousness of God is positive. It is found in the gospel. It brings us salvation and is received by faith. Scratch it down real quick so we can finish this up. Bring the end of our concepts today. All right? For my young listeners, God loves sinners. That's the central truth of the third revelation. God loves sinners. So what have we learned today? God's power is shown in creation. The response to that, the proper response to that, is to worship God. God's wrath is revealed against sin. We should reverence Him. He's not playing games with us. God's righteousness is revealed in the gospel. We should trust Him and turn to Him. God will not leave you alone in sin. You should put your faith, and I should put my faith in Him. The revelation is all around us. All around us. The facts of our world are these revelations. The question is, how will you and I respond? My invitation to you today is turn towards God today, accept the gospel, and find salvation in Jesus Christ. Amen.